Oh, it is 3 o'clock on June the 15th, 2021, and the time scheduled for a public hearing on electric rates and charges. As mayor, I am the presiding officer, and I will conduct the hearing, impose reasonable time limits on participants, and receive documents and reports into the hearing record. At today's hearing, the commission expects to hear a staff report. During the staff report, I may recognize any member of the commission to ask questions of staff. After the staff report, interested parties will be invited to ask questions. Before starting your questions, please state your name and address for the record. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the governor's executive orders related to social distancing, our meeting this afternoon is being held digitally on Zoom. Since this is a unique and for some a new meeting format, I will now provide an overview of some of the important procedural items to ensure that this meeting runs smoothly for everyone that's participating. Any interested party that has joined the Zoom meeting is automatically set to be on mute and to have their video displays hidden. At the appropriate time during the meeting, I will ask those in attendance whether they would like to speak. When this occurs, please select raise your hand option from your device. This can be accessed by hovering your mouse or cursor over the lower part of the screen where the toolbar will pop up. From that tool, select participants. This will open another toolbar on the right hand of your side of the screen. From that toolbar on the right, you can select raise hand at the bottom of the participants toolbar. When you have selected raised hand, the staff person managing the meeting will know that you have a question. I will give adequate time for these points for you to get involved in these points during the meeting to ensure that we can capture everyone who would like to ask a question. If you're having difficulty using the raised hand feature, you may also use the chat feature to type and state what you would like to speak, and we will that will be monitored by staff members managing the meeting. If you're using the chat feature, please note your name and address and confirm that you wish to ask a question of staff about electric rates. Now, if you're calling via a phone and do not have access to Zoom and the toolbar, please wait until I ask if there's anyone on the phones who would like to ask a question. I will make sure that everyone who wants to participate in the public hearing will have an opportunity to do so. After the staff report, the commission anticipates continuing the hearing to the August 17th, 2021 for additional comments of interested parties. Again, giving you an opportunity to listen to the staff report today and formulate questions that you would have. A final staff report, deliberations of the council, and adoption of the new rates and schedules. No final decisions will be made today. And so, any questions about that process? Seeing none, I will introduce our Power Resource Manager, Jamie Phillips, will begin the staff presentation and introduce our rate consultant, Mark. So Jamie, I'll turn it over to you.
Mayor, really quick, is it okay if we do a roll call before Jamie does that?
Excuse me, yes, let's do the roll call, Trina.
Sure. Okay, great. Mayor Hill?
Here.
Commissioner Tankersley?
Here.
Commissioner Gormley? You're on mute, Commissioner Gormley. Commissioner Gormley is here. Commissioner Christensen?
Present.
Thank you.
I'm here.
And Commissioner Tate?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trina. Again, we are now in the public hearing, and so Jamie, I'll recognize you, and you can move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good afternoon. Back in January, staff entered into an agreement with Utility Financial Solutions, a consultant, to perform an electric cost of service analysis and rate design, lining up with the 2-year BPA rate period to begin October 1st, 2021. So tonight, or this afternoon, Mark Beauchamp is with us to present the preliminary results of the study and share the information with the commission and have discussion and get feedback. So I'll turn it over to Mark at this point.
All right. Is everybody able to see my screen?
Yes, Mark.
Okay, good. I'm going to start because I know that there's a lot of newer people on the board. I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about myself and Utility Financial Solutions. We've been doing work in McMinnville for, I think, a little over 10 years. And we've done your electric and your water cost of service work. As a firm, we were formed in 2001. And in the past 8 years, we've done about 1,300 rate studies of various types around the United States. We've done work in 44 states, including some islands in the Caribbean and Guam. And we teach the cost of service courses and the financial planning courses for the American Public Power Association, the American Gas Association, and also for regional American Water Works associations. Now, before I get started on the details, I want to just give you a general summary of the results of the study, because financially, your electric utility is in very, very good shape. And so we're not proposing, and we don't foresee in the near future, the need for increases in revenues. However, what you will see is a recommendation and a rate design to tweak some of the rates, some a little up, some a little down. I think there's 4 rate classes in total that it's affecting. So just some minor tweaks to try to get classes closer to cost of service. You know, we've been doing that for the last 10 years and the study's in very good shape. Now, one of the things you'll see is a 5-year financial projection. And as part of that, we'll go through certain key financial targets. Key financial targets relate to things like debt coverage ratio, which you don't have any debt, you're a debt-free utility. It looks at what your minimum cash reserve levels are and compares them to your projected cash balances to make sure you have adequate cash reserves. And it looks at certain other key financial targets I'll talk about. And then the cost of service study, which is what I kind of started with, which looks at how much it costs to provide service to each class of customers and compares that to the amount of revenues we're anticipating to receive to identify, are the classes appropriately recovering their cost? Now, normally, we would present the results of those first 2, the financial projection, the cost of service, and then normally we take it back to the board of directors and say, okay, do you agree with our rate track? Do you agree with our recommendations on the cost of service and the movements in the rate designs? And we would take the board's feedback and we would go back and design the rates. Because the adjustments were so minor, we thought, well, maybe what we'll do is we'll actually present the rate design. And of course, any feedback that you have on it, because they're just minor tweaks. The other things that we were doing is we were asked to review your pilot payment to the city and the methodology. And I want to go through some of the recommended changes that we have in the pilot payment and other electric fees and charges, which is miscellaneous fees. I want to call them, most of them, all but one, are just one-time fees. So if somebody wants to be reconnected or disconnected, there's a cost associated with that. So they're like one-time fees. Now, we're also contracted to review your conduit rates. Those are not completed at this point. We're still trying to complete certain aspects of the study. So we'll present that at a later meeting. So with that, I'll move on. Now, one of the things as I go through my presentation, please, if you have any questions please stop and ask. It's usually better to ask as I'm going through than to wait for the end. So please stop and interrupt me to ask the questions. Now, when we look at assessing the financial health of a utility, we look at three key financial targets. We look at debt coverage ratio. We want to make sure that the utility has the capacity and the ability to issue debt, that they're not in violation of any bond ordinance. That's not an issue here because you're debt free, which is unusual. I mean, there's a lot of utilities out there that are debt free, but it's a very low percentage that are debt free like yourselves. Minimum cash reserves. We want to make sure that you have cash to be able to pay your bills in a timely fashion. And if some unexpected event were to occur, that you have cash in reserves to start the repair and replacement process. So it doesn't have a dramatic impact on customers' rates or bills because we need to replenish cash. So you have that buffer. And then we look at a third target called optimal operating income target. It's a little bit different way of looking at your financials. It's more like an accountant would look at it. It looks at depreciation expense and it looks at rate of return. And it's not a rate of return to make money, but it's a rate of return to break even. And I'll talk about that when I go through it. But that, in a sense, is our upper boundary. We have to make sure that you have adequate cash reserves. The target operating income is kind of like the upper boundary when we set a rate track. So we make sure you have adequate cash. That's our minimum. And our upper boundary is the operating income. We don't like to exceed that. So the minimum cash reserves, how we look at how much cash a utility needs, we primarily look at working capital needs. And that working capital is the timing difference between when you pay bills and get money from customers. For example, you may go all through the month of January paying for labor and materials, supplies. Let's say hypothetically at one billing cycle. So at the end of the month, you read all the meters and send the bills out the first week of February. You don't get that money until the second week of March. So there's that lag, that working capital lag between when you paid the bill and get the money from customers. You have to make sure that you can pay those bills in a timely fashion. So we want to make sure you have that working capital lag in your reserves at all times. We also look at things like your exposure to a catastrophic event. And usually what we do with that is we look at the age of your infrastructure. We may, in certain places, like in Florida, we may factor other things like hurricanes, but we primarily look at the age of the infrastructure. And if a utility has an older infrastructure, we assign it a higher risk factor associated with something bad happening to their infrastructure. Like I said, be it an ice storm, a windstorm, a hurricane. In your case, your infrastructure is right on average. It's the average utility around the United States has about a 50% depreciation rate, which makes sense. And that's pretty much in line with what McMinnville is. You're right at the average. So we feel your exposure to a catastrophic event is average. Then we look at your capital improvement program. We want to make sure that you have enough cash in reserves to pay for your capital improvement programs that you have targeted for that years. For other utilities, this is not an issue with McMinnville, but we look at debt service payments. In some cases, utilities don't always have as control over their rates. In a sense, they governed by the Public Service Commission. There's a few states where the municipals are governed by the PUC. And in those situations, we have to make sure they have more cash reserves because they cannot adjust rates as quickly as a utility such as McMinnville, because being governed by a board of directors, you can vary rates or change rates relatively easy. So this is the calculation on the amount of minimum cash that we feel the utility should keep in reserves. And I'm going to primarily focus on the bottom part of this. The first one, it says calculated minimum cash reserves. Let's see, I can highlight this area right here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you have a working capital lag, which is on average 45 days between when you pay bills and get the money from customers. You see this 12.3%? That represents 45 days divided by 365 days in a year. So that means that we need to maintain 1.1 million in reserves to fund that portion of the working capital. We also look at your purchase power cost and the working capital needs related to purchase power. Now, the working capital lag for purchase power is lower than your normal O&M cost, because at the end of the month of January, BPA will send you a bill. It's probably due about the third week of February. You get the money for the second week of March. So the lag is greatly reduced. However, purchase power costs fluctuate substantially on a month-to-month basis. So we look at what the maximum payment is that occurs throughout the year, and we look at that working capital lag, and we calculated that we should maintain about 3.3 million in reserves to fund that purchase power working capital lag. I'm going to skip over the next two and go to the capital improvements. I'll come back to the other two. We look at your 5-year capital improvement program, which totals about $22 million over the next 5 years. And basically, it's a very easy calculation. We take 1/5 of it. So we want to make sure that you have cash and reserves to fund the annual capital improvement program. Now we come to these two factors. These are more risk related. This first one, historical rate base. This is that exposure to a catastrophic event, such as an ice storm or a windstorm, something unexpected happening to your infrastructure. And of course, it's very difficult to say this is how much it's going to cost. I mean, if something major happened, it might be minor, it might be major. But for the purposes of this study, we want to recognize that that risk exists. We're trying to make sure that you have adequate cash and reserves to start the repair and replacement process should a catastrophic event occur, until adequate financing can be arranged. So, and we've calculated that to be about 1.5 million is our recognition of the exposure to a catastrophic event. Then we have this large item right here. This relates to, you have 2 contract customers. And for these contract customers, power supply costs are a direct pass-through. And those costs are significant. Their power supply costs are significant. McMinnville Light and Power, in a sense, is obligated to pay for that power supply from BPA. If one of those customers were to leave, McMinnville would have that excess power. So what we do is we looked at how much that customer pays in power supply cost compared to what the market price of that power supply is. In other words, if you were to lose a customer, how much could you go out and sell those kilowatt hours for? And that difference is what we've quantified as an additional risk. And it's $5.6 million. So when we looked at all of this, the minimum cash reserve that we've calculated for McMinnville is about $16 million. Your current cash reserves are at about 34 million. So again, you're in great shape financially.
Tom, you have a question for Mark?
Yes, it's for Mark and probably Jamie and maybe John too. If we were to lose one of those customers, would we have to remarket the power, or would Bonneville just not supply it for the rest of the year?
you're under contract for that at least for a period of time, aren't you, Jamie?
Right, so there's potential for some stranded costs. BPA would make us whole, I suppose, with the load shaping true up. But depending on the timing, there's potential that the bills might not get, outstanding bills may not get paid.
No, I understand about the risk of non-payment, but okay, okay, that's fine, thank you.
No, those are good questions, and it's not really, financially, you guys are very solid, and it's not really driving any changes to our recommendations.
Okay,
We've
thank you.
had that factor in for several years, and to try to recognize that risk. And sometimes the recognition of risk is difficult, because you don't always know what the potential impact is. You're just trying to protect yourself to a certain degree. It's almost like an insurance policy in a sense.
But we do have risk from BPA as far as that you haven't included, which would be for things like the financial reserve surcharges or cost recovery adjustment clauses in our contract.
Yeah.
So
Correct.
there is other risks that you haven't calculated into that number.
Correct.
John, can I ask another question? I know one of the line items dealt with kind of catastrophic costs, and the ice storm is one of the things that was mentioned. And I know we just went through a large ice storm that devastated a lot of the utilities in Oregon. Do we have a bottom line cost at this point of what the cost of the ice storm was to Mac Water and Light?
I'm trying to remember. I think it was somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000.
Okay.
And if we're working with FEMA right now, since we're declared a disaster area, and we would get 75% of that back. So
Okay.
if we do get funding.
John, this is Ed. What impact did the fire at Cascade have on sales to Cascade at this point?
So since it's a pass-through contract, it didn't have any impact on electric, but it will have on water. Because we don't have the same, they're not running, so we're not, they're not getting bills for the electricity. We're still getting our customer charge. Remember we moved the contract back in 2010 so that the energy demand transmission's the straight pass-through, and we're collecting our revenue through the customer charge. But on the water side, we're going to see an impact there.
And the
Thank you.
same goes with Organic Valley.
Organic Valley, we're going to see, we'll see an impact on revenue on electric and water, but significantly less, to the electric system. Water will be an impact. Much smaller load.
So John, any charges that BPA might impose because the power is not being taken by Cascade would be passed through to them. Is that correct? Is that how I understand it?
Right.
Okay, thank you. And Mark Beauchamp, I remember from the first time I heard you speak at AWPPA that you taught us that this is not exact science. So, but these differences we're talking about, am I correct? They don't affect the rates we would charge our customers at this point because we're already well within the safe harbor?
Correct. Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So is there any more questions on this calculation? Okay. Target operating income. Now, again, this is not affecting anything. It is a little bit of a concern I'll talk about when I get to the projection, but the target operating income, I want to explain what it is. As I mentioned earlier, it's the way an accountant would look at cost. So it includes things like depreciation expense, which is a non-cash expenditure. But when you fund depreciation expense, what it represents is the wear and tear of the infrastructure that the customers are having on the infrastructure. So in a sense, if you put $1 million asset in service with a 20-year life, every year you're going to expense $50,000. And because that's a representation of the wear and tear on that piece of the infrastructure. So the first thing that the target operating income does is it funds depreciation expense. It also funds the inflationary increase in the replacement cost of the assets. So in that example, with the $1 million infrastructure that you put in place with a 20-year life, if you only funded depreciation expense, at the end of 20 years, when you go to replace it, it's going to cost you more than $1 million to replace it. So what the target operating income represents is the inflationary increase in that replacement cost of that asset. So for example, that $1 million asset, the inflation rate on infrastructure, electric infrastructure, over the past 20 years has increased by about 3.1% a year. So in theory, we would want to set aside an additional $31,000 for the eventual replacement of that infrastructure. Now that represents the break-even rate of return. Okay, it's not a rate of return to make money, but a break-even rate of return is that inflationary increase. And in your situation, it calculated out at about a 4.9%, 5% rate of return. Now, if you were an investor-owned utility, that number would be approximately 9 to 11%. So, but that represents the break-even rate of return that we calculate out. Again, this is not driving any of our recommendations, but it does show something that we have to be aware of in the future.
So Mark, can I ask a question there?
Absolutely.
So why would a investor-owned utility be such a large, a double the rate of return?
Well, an investor-owned utility is in business to make money and pay dividends to shareholders. And so what happens when they go to the Public Service Commission, the Public Service Commission looks at, it's very theoretical, but they look at what other utilities are getting for electric utilities for rates of return around the United States. They look at discounted cash flow method, they call it. They also look at comparable risk in the stock market to the risks that electric utilities have and the returns that those other industries are getting, comparable industries. And normally, like for an investor-owned utility, it's normally between 9 and 11%. And that for like a transmission company, like for example, if you get to an area that is, you have like ATC, American Transmission Company, they're going to get even a higher rate of return. Transmission companies, since they've been formed, they've been getting between 13 and 15% rates of return. It's all related to risk. In transmission, the investments in transmission tend to be riskier. So the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission allows them a higher rate of return than the state public utility commissions. I know I'm giving you kind of a lengthy answer, but typically they get a higher rate of return.
So this is the advantage of being a consumer-owned utility versus an investor-owned utility, is that
Absolutely.
that rate of return is returned to our ratepayers directly.
That's correct. That's correct. Yep. And, we're not even getting a 4.9% because I feel that we don't need it right now. And the reason I say that is, remember I said that the target operating income, in a sense, is the upper boundary. This $2 million is our target. But when the actual operating income that we're projecting is a negative 30, we're looking at operating losses, which I try not to have those, but I have a bit of an issue here because, and it's a little bit of a balance. This isn't an exact science. And so you're trying to do reasonableness in a sense, trying to do things in a reasonable manner. And you have a utility that has no debt. You have a utility that the age of the infrastructure is right on average. It's not old, it's not new, but it's not old. And you have cash reserves that are around $30 million, where the minimum's about 15. So even though I see these negatives, I don't like to see negatives, it's difficult to justify a rate increase when we have the cash reserves. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, it's just my feeling in working with utilities. The most important thing is if you agree with me or you want me to do something differently. But obviously, I don't care to have negative operating loss. I don't like operating losses, but I don't really want to add to your cash either.
We've
And
got
the other
questions.
thing, there is a saving grace here too, in that you have a history of having this looked at every 2 years. So in 2024, or 2023, 2024, we'll come back. Somebody will come back, we'll look at this to see if we need to adjust this at that time. So, sorry, Mayor.
Go ahead. That was my fault on that because you were finishing. But we have a question from Tom and then Kathy. Go ahead.
So Mark, the first question is, if we have a $1.6 million deficit as to what you would charge to just have the adjusted operating income under your theories here,
Yeah.
Doesn't that mean that we're really selling electricity cheaper than what we really should be selling it for? We're sending a market signal that would encourage people basically to waste electricity?
I'm not disagreeing at all with what you're saying. The issue becomes this number over here. And right in 2023, for example, because it'll be looked at again around that same time, we're projected to have about $34 million in cash. And of course, if I try to correct that adjusted operating income, which it is a projection, that's going to add to my cash balances.
Yeah, well, I mean,
That's what my concern is.
the $200,000 difference doesn't concern me. That's something that, may or may not happen. But the other one does, especially on the last slide, as I looked at it, the previous slide, it looked to me like you were not calculating the return on the capital, the cost of replacing the system. You had somehow treated contributed capital different than capital that we had bought in, right?
That's correct.
And
yes.
But once somebody contributes it, don't we have to replace it just the same as if we'd bought it in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we do in the study, and of course you don't have this part of the detail, but when we see contributed capital, now when an asset's contributed and put on the books, you start the process of depreciating it. So the depreciation expense gets put on the books. Now, what we do in the cost of service study is we remove that portion of the depreciation expense. Because in theory, this is how we look at it. We'll go back to that $1 million asset, but this time the $1 million asset is contributed. If the customer paid the $1 million, and then we charge the depreciation expense, we'd recover that $1 million again. So at the end of the time period, theoretically, the customer would have paid $2 million for that asset. So we remove depreciation expense from it to prevent the double charging for our customers.
Excuse me, Mark. But if you do that, and it's the $1 million, and 20 years later, we have to replace the asset. Okay, where does the money come to replace that asset?
Correct. You haven't that comes from the utility. Let's do two assets side by side. One is the utility invested $1 million.
Right.
So $1 million cash outflow. Then you depreciate the $1 million over the 20 years. So you get the $1 million back. So $1 million out, $1 million in, that's to zero.
Right.
If the customer paid for that $1 million, you have no cash outflow. So your cash outflow is zero at that point. Now, if you charge depreciation expense, now you've recovered $1 million with no cash outflow. So you've actually charged the customer $1 million. Where the other one, it balances out. And so to prevent that from occurring, so to keep them in balance, the practice in the industry is to remove depreciation expense on contributed capital. Now, one of the things that I do in this calculation is in that example of the $1 million, if the asset was contributed, I'm going to remove depreciation expense. When I go to replace it, McMinnville has to fund the $1 million, but every year the replacement cost of that asset increases. So what I'm trying to recover is the inflationary increase in the replacement cost of the asset. So theoretically, when we do go to replace it, and let's say it costs $1.5 million, we've recovered $500,000, but we have to add the $1 million to it. Does that make sense?
Well, yes, except if we looked at it, if this was the only asset the utility had,
Okay.
then at the end of that period, we're going to have to go out and borrow the $1 million, aren't we? Because we're not going to,
That's right.
right?
That is right. Yes, you'd have to go out and borrow it.
So if you did this, and I realize that we're different than most utilities, but then we don't go out and borrow money to do this. So, but if we had enough contributed capital, we would not be able to remain debt free using your model, right?
That is correct. That is correct. And that is part, obviously I can apply these theoretical practices, but ultimately becomes a decision of the board, and what the practices that they want us to look at. If we wanted to continue, and that was a practice that the board wanted to maintain, wanted to do, we could certainly do that.
Yeah, if we wanted to stay debt free in the long term, we would, as the contributed capital got greater, we would have to be careful. We put aside money to replace that as well, right?
Correct. You would if you wanted to stay debt free. That is correct. Go ahead.
So do you look at what that contributed capital is? Or is
It's
it
about,
just assuming what it is?
we do review that, and that was reviewed a few years ago. It is a substantial effort on staff's part, and it does change, or we did add to it, but it's about $12 million.
Well, the reason I was asking, some of those assets may have different life cycles.
Yeah.
And so, the depreciation expense may not be the same for the whole asset or the whole $12 million.
Correct. We tried to review that. We estimated that, and that was removed in the detailed calculations. We removed the depreciation expense on the contributed capital, trying to take those factors into account.
Go ahead, Kathy.
Well, it's hard to follow Tom. I think he got far ahead of where I was thinking about, but I think because I'm so new here, I'm really trying to kind of get my head wrapped around all of this. I did have a couple of questions, I guess, when we got to the projection summary and we're looking at the idea that we can afford to have the projected cash balances continue to decrease because we have no debt and we have so much more than we need for the operating income. But I guess a couple of things I wondered were factored in there is when we talk about some of our future planning. Like I'm new, so I know there's lots of conversation about future projects and the new water plant, and there's some big investments coming down the road, and that is combined with right now, I think what we're seeing with the cost of materials and inflation and what that's going to do to some of those budgets that were currently in place over the next few years. And I'm just wondering how much of future growth and improvements and unexpected expenses are sort of built into that idea that we can afford to have, a projected cash balance that's going down. Does that make sense?
No, it does. It's actually an excellent question. I'm going to try to answer it in a couple of ways as best I can. We're projected to spend about $22 million in capital in the electric industry, in the electric department, I mean. So the water plant, of course, isn't included in that, but this is just electric. So it's 22 million. Now, every year we are adding to our cash. I mean, you're not seeing it directly in here, but there is a certain contribution that's going into capital replacement from rates. So that's funding a certain amount of your cash. Now, when I look at 2022 and 2023, this color is not a good color. Try this one. A little bit better. In 2023, we're looking at about 34 million. So we're looking at a relatively stable cash reserves. It isn't until 2024 that we start to see the decline in cash. And that's attributed not necessarily just to your capital program. There's a certain projected adjustment from BPA that's also in our projections that's also affecting our cash reserves. Now, some of these, when you do a financial projection, this is just from our experience. When we look 1 or 2 years out, usually even 3 years out, we're usually really close, especially years 1 and 2. Once you start getting beyond years 3, because these models are built on assumptions related to inflation, which you mentioned, Kathy. But this is inflation on like labor, material, supplies, and just some limited degree of the capital. It's also built on growth, and it's built on changes in BPA costs. It's built on your capital improvement program assumptions. There's a lot of assumptions going into it. And some of those will materialize and some may not. So as a result, when you start looking out 4 or 5 years, the results are probably going to be different. And the good thing about McMinnville is you look at this every 2 years. So in 2023, when we look at this, your cash is still pretty consistent with what it is in 2022. Now in 2024, if we come back and we say, okay, we assume no growth, for example, and there's there's some growth up and down each year. So it's very minimal. That we used in the modeling, but something else happened. You did have some growth. Well, maybe we don't need this. We don't have to have any increase because our cash is higher than we expected. Let's say that your capital improvement program, you find a substation transformer that you didn't know needed to be replaced, but something happened to it. That's a major cash outflow. Now, what you have is you have cash to, one, be able to pay it for it, and two, cash reserves that allow us to buffer any adjustments. So we look at it and we say, okay, our cash is declining. We had that $2 million expenditure we didn't expect. So our cash, instead of being 32, is 30. Okay. So we need to get the cash reserves back. We can look at the projected rate adjustments then. If we even had 1.5% adjustments for 3 years, we're going to get our cash back in line. So what I'm trying to do is to keep our cash relatively stable. Although that's my perception. What's more important is your perception. If you think the cash reserve should go up, where I'm trying to more keep them stable. And I don't know if that's a direct objective of the board or But I feel like in 2024, if something unexpected happens, or even if this projection occurred, we could have a modest adjustment in 2024, which would bring us right back in line. You see, what I've experienced, and maybe I'm bringing along some baggage I shouldn't from other utilities, but what I've experienced is sometimes having too much cash is more difficult than not having enough cash, which I know sounds unusual, but it's because when you don't have enough cash, it's easy to justify an increase. But when you have large cash reserves, customers can sometimes pressure the utility to lower rates because they feel that they have too much in cash. And that's something I always try to prevent from occurring, unless I really feel it's justifiable. Because when you have a rate reduction that lowers your cash balances and you start getting into a cash burn situation, then at some point in the future, when you go to reverse that cash burn and get the cash back up, it requires large increases. So it becomes more of a balancing effect on the whole process. But the key thing is this: the $34 million cash reserves, which in my opinion, I feel it's good. It's very good. If you feel that maybe we should continue to grow that, then we can definitely do that with just modest adjustments. I just feel that the 34 million is a good number.
So question mark, did you go back and look at historically how we performed as far as our operating income versus the projections?
I did look at the last one, and your operating income actually came pretty close. There were some years that you were higher and some years when you were a little lower. But it was in the general ballpark of what was projected historically. But we can go back and actually look at that in more detail.
Okay.
If Kathy, are you finished? Because if you are, I have a follow-up. Otherwise, I want to give you a chance to finish. Okay. So if we, and I do agree that the 34 million is a good number, and I don't want to reduce it very much. Then if in 2024 we felt like we had to get it back up there, what kind of a rate increase would it be to raise the additional $1.6 million? What percentage?
Yeah. If it's okay, I want to bring up the actual model. I think I have it. So there's a lot of tabs in the model. Okay, now this is the okay, this is the cash reserves that we're looking at. So let's say in 2024, we want to reverse this. Let's do 1%. This a little bit bigger. So this is a 1%. Let's do it for 3 years.
The 1% just seems to hold it steady at 32 million, right? 30,
Correct.
not even that. So
You would, yeah, you probably have to go upwards around, there we go, about 2% starting in 2024 for 3 years if this projection held true.
and then that would still leave, it'd still be heavy going down, right? You'd still go down from.
Well, your capital improvement program is fluctuating. It's kind of
Right, but I mean,
relatively stable.
but if you look at that, it's close. You're still going down though. So my concern is that you're kind of setting us up to maybe have a bigger rate increase than we would rather have. And with your guidance, as I recall, we have kind of smoothed out rate increases for our customers so they don't have big bumps.
Correct. No, and that, yes, and that's something that I've always emphasized. I guess we could do a small adjustment, but if we did, well, let's take a look.
I mean, not even now. What if you did a small adjustment next year? It's like 1%. Yeah. Then make that next one a 1, 2.
Yeah.
You see that 1% actually stabilized it really nicely. Okay, it's still coming down just slightly, but it's pretty stable. Based on the projections, the assumptions that we're using. Now, what I guess the 1% would definitely give us protection.
Yeah, so if we look at 1, yeah.
There we go.
And we're also we're not sending the wrong price signals to people about how much electricity to use.
Yeah.
We're sending less of a wrong signal.
Yes. No, I agree with you. I actually like this. If as a board you're okay with the cash reserves, which right now the projected reserves are stable with this rate track.
And then I think Ed has a comment.
Yeah.
If you go down and you basically go to 30 million, if our goal was to stay between 34 and 35, every time we delay, it's just that much harder to get that number back up.
Yeah.
So, and going back to Tom's comments about not having huge rate increases, I think historically we're better off to do small charges to keep that money up there, and that's our goal and our philosophy, if you will.
How about this? How does this look? I ran starting in 2023, 1.5%.
But in the 5th year, you are $1.5 million, $1.6 million almost less. And there's a lot of things we could be doing with $1.6 million.
All right.
But Ed, I think on that one we have some room. If we need to adjust it, we can at that point. But I feel much more comfortable with this by not.
Okay, so there we are. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think we need to go up though. I don't think we need to put another $1 million in the pot now.
Well, the other question that we have, and it was just a discussion we had at the beginning when we were looking at our assets, and Mark indicated that the usefulness of our assets were right in the middle of what the industry standard would be. Is there a desire on the part of the commission to be at a little higher than average, given costs are going to be going up tremendously year over year, that inflationary piece? And is it better to be a bit ahead of the usefulness life of our assets? I just throw that out also. Maybe another piece that we take into consideration to continue smaller bumps than not having increases, and then at a certain time having increased costs for acquisition or replacement of assets.
What's really amazing is when I put in 1.5%, cash stays right in line. Operating income, we eliminated those big net deficits. Of course, this is a rate track, but what this would mean is 1.5% adjustments in 22 and 23.
So is that across the board, or is that played with the various rate categories?
It would be adjusted. It would be, let me show you the result, the other part of the study, which is this. So if we were to do 1.5% for 2 years, when I look at this, residentials might get a little bit more than 1.5, maybe like 1.75. But when I look at their average, they are at they're at 10.1. Now the study said that ideally you need an 8.6%. That's to hit that target operating income. Now residentials are at 10.1, just slightly higher than the average increase. The wheeling, that's a real small rate class. Then you have general service, which is your second largest class, at 4.8%. So basically any increase I gave to residentials, I would give them general service a little less. So for example, if I gave the residentials 1.75, I would probably give general service about 1.25, approximately. All the other classes are pretty small.
I'm sorry, is general service bit like businesses?
Yes, correct.
So Mark, do you ever, in the digesting of all this, look at market? So that we have some reflection or concern on market? There's a couple of things, we want to have the best rates we can for the, for our citizens and the rate payers in our service territory. We also want to have the ability to attract business if at all possible.
Correct.
So,
And we can certainly look at, we do have some data on other utilities in Oregon that we can look at. I'm sure that we can get some others if you wanted to see. I take it you're obviously your focus is on the general service and probably on the residential.
We have that data, Mark, here. We do that comparison here.
Oh, okay. We can look at that and see how that compares to the study results. I don't think.
In a business that's not a monopoly, one of the ways we try to look at revenue is, what savings can we generate, those kinds of things. And do you ever you talked about us being in the middle on our depreciation or our infrastructure and that, but did you ever make an assessment saying, some of these costs you've got are out of whack compared to other places?
We have looked at that, but to a limited degree.
Okay.
I can say this, that there is no cost that I saw in McMinnville that I felt were out of line in a sense.
So based on,
Everything appeared reasonable. The numbers lined up well, even from a cost of service perspective, because we get the detail. We're only showing you the outputs of the model. The model has a lot of detail, and we can tell how much it costs to provide service for every component of your system. And when we go through it, of course, we're looking at that detail, and we're assessing that detail to see if there's anything that looks out of line. And we do that to ensure the integrity of the study. But a byproduct of that is it helps us to identify the operations of the utility itself. And there was nothing in McMinnville that was online.
so are you looking at numbers? Or are you looking at the kilowatts we project, sell, or number of meters to kind of level the playing field?
We're looking at the numbers from the cost of service study. In other words, how much it costs to provide residential service on a per kilowatt hour basis to give them for distribution substations or for wires, transformers, those types of things. It's all broken out in detail in study. So we look at that. because it helps us to assess not just the operations of the utility, but the accounting practices of the utility.
So you're looking at the FERC chart of accounts to compare us to others, so you have apples to apples?
That is correct. That gives us, yes. And without getting into too much complexity, the answer is yes.
But for the board's consideration, if, those first numbers he had, we were, down about $1.5 million or so from one year to the next. If you look at our capital expenditures and we forego buying some trucks or some equipment one more year, and we've done that before, that'll generate a lot of money real quick.
Correct.
So I think we've got to be cognizant of all this and not be afraid to say, sorry, staff, we want you to get by one more year with some stuff.
Kathy?
Yes, the projected revenues versus the cost of service for residential, is that all recurring revenues? Is that all service fees, or is there any one-time expenses to the customer that are included in that?
No, this number right here for like residential, that 14.8 million is only rate related. So for your residentials, it's going to be the monthly customer charge and the energy rates. That's what represents that 14.8. The one-time fees that you referred to, those are what we call expense offsets. So in the cost of service, let's say hypothetically, you get $500,000 in other fees. That $500,000 for our purposes goes to offset expenses. So it reduces the overall revenue requirements. In this case, that 16 million is being reduced by the 500,000 in my example.
So when you think about rate increases, do you ever think about increases in one-time revenues or other areas, as opposed to looking at it all as a rate increase? I'm just trying to think about, I don't know, expansion, what's new going to come in the next 2 years. I realize that that's going to increase the amount of electric that we have to get, but I'm just wondering if you get revenues any other way than rate increases, I guess.
Yes, there is a multitude, and actually let me just, if it's okay, I'm going to jump to another section. One of the things that we looked at was your electric fees. So, and we're proposing some adjustments in your fees, although those are relatively modest. Now, there's another thing that you had mentioned, and it has to do with new customers and line extension policies, for example. And when new customers come on in the system, what occurs is usually, and the way your policy works, is let's say that the cost to extend service to, let's say it's a business, is $100,000. And there's a methodology that you have that identifies how much the utility would pay of that 100,000 and how much the customer would pay. So let's say that the calculations comes at 60,000 paid by the utility and 40,000 by the customer. So that's also, I think it was reviewed 2 years ago, Jamie, wasn't it? I believe the line extensions were looked at a couple of years ago.
Yes, but we don't fund, the utility does not fund that. The customer pays 100% of that cost.
That's right. The customer pays 100%. So there is, yes, that's right. In your case, customer pays 100%. So you don't have any cash outflow from that.
Right. So that shows up as a contribution and aid to our capital budget.
Yeah.
But I guess the question, one question I would ask is that if you look at our capital program, what would a utility typically use, or what is the rule of thumb for replacement of your assets? How many dollars or how much should you be replacing of your system on an annual basis? So if you're using depreciation, what is the number that we should be replacing every year?
We can get you that, John. We have the depreciation number, but it's more than just depreciation that you look at. The other part of it is the inflation number. And what I can do is I can work that out and get that to you by the end of the week to give you that information.
Right, and that kind of goes back to the mayor's question about the capital.
Yeah.
And to make sure that we want to make sure that we're, not spending too much, but we want to make sure we're spending enough to continue to keep our system in good shape.
Well, let me give you an idea on that. Your depreciation expense is about $2.5 million a year. With contributed capital, it's roughly $3 million a year. And your capital plan is about $5 million a year, which just looking at that number appears reasonable to me. And it appears reasonable to me because I know that this number is not enough in the long term, that the expenditure for capital should be greater than that. So the other part of it I look at is this target operating income. That's the inflationary piece. So if I add these two together, and this isn't what I'm doing right now is just a real quick and dirty. It would approximate about $4.5 million. And you are right in line with that. And look at your capital plan. So I hope that gave you some comfort, Mayor. You are right in line with it.
But the question that I had is, do we want to be ahead of the average, or is that a wise posture to take?
The way I look at it, and I'm not an engineer, I'm an accountant, all right, so I want to qualify that. I feel that assets that need to be replaced and preventative maintenance needs to occur. But obviously, the engineering department usually assesses the infrastructure periodically on what needs to be replaced, and I don't know if infrastructure that's working fine needs to be replaced, especially large pieces of it. Obviously preventative maintenance needs to be done, but I think that's probably more of a question for the engineering department.
So what I would say about that is when you start to do that, you start to affect your reliability.
Correct.
And then what ends up usually happening is you're playing catch up and you end up spending more in
Yes.
the long run because of that.
Yeah.
And the question then comes, the value of having more cash on hand as compared to having more updated capital or assets out in the field. I mean, there's this happy medium, I'm sure, because you don't want to be replacing everything just because you have cash, but finding that optimal place so that we don't have a lot of quote unquote breakdowns that become immediate problems that take us out of cycle and use our manpower not as efficiently as we should.
Well, and what ends up happening is when you get in those situations, you have to increase manpower to cover those things. And so, that is one of the things that we really have an advantage here is if you look at our manpower, it's very flat. And we very rarely have to have a spike in that manpower because we are doing a fairly flat or very even replacement of assets over time.
Well, one example, John, would be the transmission lines that we bought from BPA. We're going to do that slowly over time and not do it all at once, so it becomes a burden on the line crews, but if we can do that and spread it over time, we have transmission poles that are in place in good shape. So I mean, there's this weighing of that process.
Exactly. You know, we want to continue to make sure we're always doing, you know, the rule of thumb is always doing a little bit every year.
Yeah.
Because then we're not going to get bit at the, you know, at the end or something.
And as I understand Scott's point, using that transmission line issue, if it turns out those poles were really crumbling and needed to be replaced now, we should hire somebody to do it because we're going to have these other costs, right? But you feel like the system, the program you have to replace those poles on that line is reasonable given the life expectancy of the poles. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
You know, so for example, we replaced 5 of the poles in that line from the north side of Baker Creek to the creek. But we did that because the city or the developer's going to come in and put in the linear park there. And we don't want to have to go back in 2 or 3 years to replace poles and then damage those facilities and have to replace those facilities on top of it.
Yeah. And that's another reason we want to have the cash, I think, if we need to do something like that.
Correct. Yep.
What I did is I put the series of 1.5% rate adjustments, and I would like to do one more thing. I know I don't want to take too much of the board's time. So I started getting too lengthy. Please let me know, John. I will speed it up. I just wanted to give you an indication of what that means from a residential rate standpoint. If we were to go with like a 1.75% adjustment. So right now you have 2 blocks, you know, what's called the inclining block rate. And I think that was something that the board wanted to do a few years ago. We've kept it in place. So what I'm going to do. That didn't work. Sorry about that. Maybe I shouldn't do this on screen. I know what I did wrong, and now my system's in a circular reference, but it'll work its way out. There we go.
But you know, you're looking at the kilowatt hour rate, but also the customer charge.
Correct. Your customer charges is in good shape.
Yeah.
That when we looked at the cost of service study, you're currently charging on average $15.10 per month for residential. The cost of service study said $14.95. So what my plan was to keep that at that $15.10. And not to increase that any further. Now with the general service, we're hoping maybe we could increase that a little bit. The same thing with the irrigation.
Yep.
So.
Okay.
Mark, given the recovery that's happening at this point, hopefully will continue to happen, I would appreciate seeing in your rate discussion here, not only the 1.5% for 4 or 5 years, what have you done there, but also a lower rate the first year for next year, like 0.5% or 1% or even flat. I'd like to see that. I think it's very important that we keep the cash about where it is, but I think it's also important that we not unnecessarily put a burden on customers. So maybe we can make this, smooth it that way. And I had one quick question that goes to my idea of keeping this projected cash balances. When I look at your rate of return with rate adjustments and the determinant is net book value. So that's after the depreciation's been taken, right?
That's correct.
So back to your $1 million asset, if that were only if that were the only asset in the utility, and we said it was a 20-year asset, so 10 years into it, you would only be using half of that value, right? Because you would have already taken half the depreciation.
It's very observant of you, Tom. I want to show you what we do.
Okay.
You see this system equity number right here, 5.6 in my model. What that is we look at the net book value, the age of the system. It's a formula, but
Okay.
let's just use your example. It's easier. You said $1 million asset was invested. It's halfway through its depreciable life.
Right.
So let me show you the numbers. So we need to set aside 3.2% each year for inflation, which is 32,000, but it's halfway through the life. So the book value is only 500,000. What we do is we double, basically. We adjust the rate of return
Okay.
to get back to the 32.
Okay,
That's why you see the 5.6.
I feel better about it. That's good. Okay.
That's a great question, Tom. I appreciate that, you observing that.
Okay. So again, and you know, the rest of the commission needs to weigh in on this, but I would like to see if you put together some rate programs, maybe even two alternatives of, you know, one with a little less rate increase, if maybe even none this first year, and then after that have them come in, so we keep the numbers roughly where they should be.
Mm-hmm. Well, what we could do, right now I did put the 0.5% and then the 1.5%. So you see that
Okay,
cash
great.
is still pretty stable.
Oh, that's good. I thought I saw 1.5% earlier, so that's
Yeah, that's the one that we talked about earlier, and I put that in the model. But if we wanted to forego that 0.5%, this is what happens, has a relatively modest impact. So I think we could do the 0 and the 1.5.
Mhm.
See, we're right around the $34 million.
Yeah.
And we still have a lot of flexibility. We have no rate increase in 2022. Now, when we go, we'll be asking for a 2-year rate track. So the 1.5% will be reflected for next year. So we can get that back to you for your next meeting.
But before you do those numbers, check with everybody else and make sure this is what other people are thinking about too, please.
So Mark, that adjustment you made, we went from the 35 disappearing out of about 5 years, correct?
Yes, it went to 33. I think initially we were at this level. Yeah, calculate it. Yeah, 35 million. We dropped to 33 million.
5 periods that were 35 million within 100, 110, $120,000. You know, so that 0.5%, you know, makes it hard for it to come back if you look at it, because that. So I don't know, Tom. I don't know about that 0.5%, to be honest with you.
Okay, maybe we should. Let's hear what everybody else says, and maybe we ought to have them come back both ways, and we can make a decision when we make the decision. But
Okay.
The rest of the commission's input too.
We're gonna do this again. I mean, this analysis is gonna come back to us again in 2 years, right?
Yes.
Is that accurate? So, I mean, while I think we have to plan for the future, it seems like planning out to 2026. I mean, it's good to do those projections out, but yeah, I feel like we're in a interesting time these next 2 years. I don't know. I feel like things are pretty unstable in a lot of areas. Yeah, I don't know. Jody, what are your thoughts around this?
Jody had to leave the meeting for about an hour, so she's not here at the moment. She'll be back.
Okay, I couldn't see
So
it.
Kathy, here's something that I've always looked at, and this makes the staff just a little bit annoyed.
Huh?
But you look at the capital improvements, that those dollars there,
Yes,
if we forego 25% of that, say 1 year, or if we look at the equipment purchase or something, we can make those numbers, move pretty quick.
right. Right.
So, I'm not afraid, short of, there's two parts of our business. One is the infrastructure that delivers the electricity. The other is the huge amount of equipment we use to operate the business.
Yeah.
And my focus has always been to try and keep the pipes operating to sell the product, but maybe we forego a little bit of maintenance, or make the equipment last 1 more year. I mean, you can relate to that with your own business. So.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we've never raised our rates, so this is all new to me. But we constantly try to figure out this secret, sauce for taking care of our systems and taking care of everything and still making it, a good value for our customers.
Kathy, this is a board game monopoly in real world. It's a franchise.
It is so interesting, and you guys have done such an amazing job, but you also have so much experience and knowledge here, and I'm really, trying to learn. But
Well, we want you to tip over the old guys.
well, you guys are pretty fantastic, but I really feel like a rate adjustment this year based on what I'm seeing doesn't feel really necessary. But I do feel like we do need to lay the groundwork that we'll have to do something in the future to maintain that level of projected cash that we feel like we need, to take
So
care
one of the things that's happened to us, and Tom will help me explain this to you, but we got way behind the 8 ball with water rates because we had that luxury of that outside income coming in. And philosophically, the board for decades, we're going to use that to subsidize it. Well, our water production cost compared to the actual, what we sold a gallon of water for a cubic foot, was way off the beat. We were losing money with every meter was losing us money. So, I mean, it took us 5 years, Tom, to finally get to a break-even point. So, but so that's why we like to, I philosophically, instead of, you'll have PG come in with a 5 to 10% increase or something. We have worked hard to try and have them be in the 1 and 2%, and that's when we got it. And the biggest hit's always been what Bonneville did to us to jab us with a huge rate, and we've absorbed it over several years to try and have a big, and that's where this cash comes in, is that we have no prediction. And one of my biggest fears, Tom's heard me say this, John's heard me say this, Scott, if the Congress would ever decide Bonneville needed to pay up, we could see huge rates, because if your guy from San Diego, a congressman from San Diego, paying 17 to 20 cent power, and find out McMinnville, Oregon, selling power for a nickel, there's some equity issue here. We're going to make Bonneville start paying more money. Yeah. So I always worry about that, and that's an unknown we can't put here on paper.
So Mark, what if you put a 1.75 in those years instead of 1.5 and left the first year 0?
And while he's doing that, I'm just going to weigh in a little bit. I truly understand Tom and Ed, how hard it has been to recoup and get us back into this projected cash balances and keeping that near the 35 million. The question that I might have is, as we're coming out of the pandemic, if we had no increase in 2022, it seems like the rebounding that we're going through right now, cost to the consumer and to business, is at a higher rate for whatever reason, building costs, you name it, have gone sky high. And this gives just a little, it gives a year to rebound a little bit. And I like the thought of maybe if we do go up to 175, that again, that brings us not at the 35 million, but just below that a bit.
At 34, yeah.
Yeah, I like this chart. That's a good question, John. Ed, does that make sense to you? I hear what you're saying.
Well, it's just interesting how the numbers drop.
Yeah.
You get almost 35 million to begin with, and within 5 years, you're down to 33.9. You've lost $1 million.
Yeah.
But the other thing to remember here is that we don't know what Bonneville's going to do.
Yeah.
And this rate period, we're seeing a rate decrease, but there's no guarantee we're going to see one in the next rate period.
Yeah. And I think this is okay, because after 2 years, if we need some more revenue, we're starting at a low enough 1.75 kind of presumed increase that if we bump it up some more, we're still at an increase that'll be, at or below inflation of other things. So.
Well, and we're not locked in. I mean, we're not locking anything in. I mean, we're saying 2023, but is 1.75, but then we're going to look at the numbers again and project out further. And if that number has to go to 2 or 220, 2.25, at least there's an expectation that the 1.75 is already coming, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, we will have to do whatever we have to do if we've set that target at that 34 and 35. Things could change in the month it'll be a month before we see these again, probably.
Right.
What's going to happen in a month, especially with what we see with material costs and stuff like that, and what's it going to be like in a year, and then factor in the precariousness of Bonneville. It's just, we do the best we can for this moment that we're dealing with it right now, and it's kind of always catching up.
So Mark, you have about a half an hour left.
Okay. Well, I think the timing is perfect. If it's okay with the board, I'll go ahead and design 2 years worth of rates with a 0% increase in revenues for 2022. And then I'll do some revenue neutral rate changes. And then in 2023, have a 1.75 overall impact. Now, I will vary that slightly by rate class, depending upon, looking at this chart. So residentials, I'll make it a little bit closer to 2, general service a little less than 1.75. But I'll kind of work a little bit, just slightly, because rates are pretty close to cost of service right now. So as long as the board, are you in agreement with that? Does that sound like a good plan? So, does that sound like a good plan with a 1.75, but maybe residential is a little bit closer to a 2, and general service maybe a little bit closer to like a 1.5?
Fine with me.
Yeah, Mark, it's my understanding that you try to be under 10% in the difference, realizing that it's not an exact science. So if you don't need to go that much and you still can stay under 10, that'd be fine. But I understand you're going to have a bigger rate in residential increase than you are in general service, because that's what cost of service calculations are being done for. But it doesn't. I've never felt we had to get any closer than 10.
Yeah. Now your cost of service results, all your major classes are really close. So the customer charge, what I'll do is the residential, I'll probably freeze that to 1510. We're right at that number. General service and the rate design, I actually moved that up a little bit, which means the energy rate will come down some. And then irrigation, the customer charge will go up a little bit. So again, just to tweak it, move it closer to cost of service is an objective, but at the same time minimizing as much as possible rate impacts on customers within the groups. So obviously, if we have a 1.75% increase, I don't want somebody to call and say, well, I just got a 20% rate increase. So we want to minimize that kind of stuff from occurring. Yeah. So I can jump to, because we'll come back with the rate design, the pilot discussion. Now, one of the things I was asked to do is to look at your pilot. Look at McMinnville's Water and Light's practice of gross power collections, how it's calculated with the pilot. And if I would and to review it for any recommendations on modifications to the pilot. And looking at the industry, in a sense, we currently calculate pilot on revenue collected from customers, and most utilities calculate the pilot on billed revenues. So what you're going to see is basically two things that I'm requesting modifications or recommending. One is to change from the collection method to the revenue billed method. And if there is any bad debts that get adjusted from revenues, when it's actually taken as a bad debt. That's one of the major items. The other one is that we pay pilots on operating revenues. But in order to do that in a way that I feel is correct, we need to modify your accounting classifications on what operating revenues are. And I'll show that in this slide.
Hey, Mark, sorry to interrupt you. Could you, for everybody's edification, the acronym PILOT stands for?
I'm sorry, payment in lieu of tax.
Okay.
And it's the payment that's made to the city. And it's a common practice in the electric industry that that there is a pilot payment made to the city. And it goes back years and years ago when investor-owned utilities primarily served the areas, the whole country. And they paid property taxes to the city. So when they formed their own municipals, property taxes were no longer a source of revenue for the city. So the municipals subsequently replaced it with a pilot payment. And that's how this pilot payment was established. And you're at a 6% pilot on basically what I'm proposing is operating revenues, which isn't that much different than what you're currently doing, which is pretty much right in line with the industry standards. APPA does a survey every couple of years. The pilot payment on average throughout the US, depending on who's participating in the survey, but it varies between about 5.4% of revenues to a high of about 5.8%. So the 6% on your base is right near the average. Then you have the 3% on your contract customers. That was established when the contract customers came on. So your calculation to me appears reasonable. It's not excessively high, nor is it excessively low. So now what I'm looking at, this is how you currently do the calculation. All of these items are included. Whoops, sorry. These items, anything marked yes, is included in the pilot calculation. So then you have some things that are not. One of the things is the McMinnville utilities billings. And we're proposing that two things, basically these items down here that are currently classified as non-operating revenue in your accounting be considered or changed, modified to an operating revenue classification, okay? And in your financials. And the reason I'm requesting that is then anybody looking at it would be able to look at your operating revenues and say, okay, we're going to pay 6% on operating revenues with the exception of the industrial sales, and it's 3%. So it simplifies the calculation. Also, it'd be based on billed revenues, less bad debt. And what I mean by that, when you look at this slide, this is the sample calculation that I put together. And this would be your operating revenues. All of these are in this grouping. And then down here, you see bad debts. So if there are bad debts in the system, that they periodically get written off. And so that would reduce the bottom line revenue. And so that would adjust your payment to the city. But what this does is it simplifies the calculation. The city will get a little bit more revenue from this. I think it equates to, Mark did a review of it, and it's around about $20,000 more a year, primarily driven by this, by this number right here. This was not included in the pilot calculation previously, and now it's included. So that caused the overall payment to the city to increase by approximately $20,000 annually. So I guess my question to the board is, with the changes I'm proposing, do you have any concerns or any questions on what I'm proposing?
Go ahead, Ed.
I guess I want to know from Sam, the document that drives all this, if we're interpreting it too liberally, or if it's being interpreted properly. Because
Well,
I mean, the nutshell thing is it's power company's revenue, but I mean, do we do very specific language in there about?
well, maybe just start with the statute. I know Mr. Beauchamp kind of made a reference to why we do this, and he kind of spoke about it in generalities. But there is a state statute that this addresses this specifically. I'm just going to read you a couple of the sections of it because I think it's kind of self-explanatory. I hope it is. And this is in chapter 225, and it discusses the application of earnings. The earnings of the electric plant or distributing system of an electric system shall be applied and used in payments of warrants and interest thereon issued in connection with operation of any such plant or system, and also in payment for alterations, improvements, additions, or extensions, and for the redemption and retirement of outstanding bonds, together with interest thereon, and shall not be expended, and shall be expended only in connection with and for improving such plant or system, and not for other municipal purposes, except as otherwise provided in ORS 225-270. Now, I read you that application of earnings provision because it actually kind of tracks with our sort of our annual, our budgeting that you'll talk about, and the findings that we will make every year for our for alterations, improvements, additions, and extensions. It sort of chimes that same language. So the city, the revenues of the electric fund can only be used for the electric fund purposes, except as provided in this other statute. The other statute reads it like as follows. When any city owns or operates a municipal electric power plant, has paid principal and interest to date on all indebtedness incurred in connection therewith, so you have no debt, and has created and accumulated an adequate depreciation and replacement reserve in the judgment of the officer having control of such plant or system, that's the commission, the city shall, for the purpose of reducing general property taxes within such city, pay to itself not less than 3% of the annual gross operating revenue of such plant or system. So if you've got no debt and you are, what was the other thing I said? You have no debt, and then in the judgment of the commission, the operating officers, you don't need additional funds for improvement of the system, then you actually have an obligation to pay yourself or pay the city. The statute doesn't foresee a bifurcated city, but you have an obligation to pay yourself 3% of the annual gross operating revenue. That's the term the statute uses. So I hope, I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, Commissioner Gormley, but I just wanted to give you that base of understanding. That's kind of the jump off point. You can do more than 3%, but actually, if you're in a situation like we may find ourselves now, you're actually required to pay at least 3% of gross operating revenue.
Okay, so if we have farm income coming, is that part of this revenue?
That's
Well, the question is that line item in the accounting system gross operating revenue? Is that your question?
Yeah, I mean, is it applicable within the statute then? And just like cable TV, it's technically not electricity, you know.
Right. I think there are things that we've been collecting, and I would have to, I'm sorry, I may have to defer to Mr. Beauchamp and Mr. Dunmeyers to the category for accounting purposes. But there are things like, for example, it's easier for me to understand when we collect money that comes in that basically is paying for like conservation loans. That's not operating income. But as it's in the past, I think as it's hit our accounts, we've actually used that as part of the calculation for the pilot. And that's arguably incorrectly. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about here is sort of using the right categories of income and categorizing the correct things into the calculation. Now, I think just for historical purposes, some of these things I think historically may have simply been agreed upon between Water and Light and the city. For example, the fact that we don't add in operating revenue from the city. It seems like historically, the oral history here is that was just something that was agreed upon. I can't say we have any written documentation of that, but it seems to, but that's how it's been done for years and years and years. And I can tell you that these payment in lieu of taxes have been made to the city since at least the 1940s, if not earlier. I mean, this is not a new thing. So it's been done for decades.
I understand. Just I want to be sure we're being consistent.
Sure.
Because the money to the city has been has grown, each year, especially with Bonneville's rates jabbing them up and stuff. And I think we'd be all shocked if we looked at the rates 15 years ago compared to what they are right now, or the payment we make.
So I would say the other thing is historically that the agreement or the decision as to what the pilot and the amount of the pilot has been something that over time, I can look historically back in the 1960s, as early as the 60s, I could find evidence of basically agreements sort of being an agreement between the commission and the city council, and that tradition has sort of continued on. More recently, it hasn't. It's been more of just a unilateral decision of the city, but historically, it's been kind of a joint decision between the two bodies as to what the pilot should be.
Yeah, the mayor was the umpire, and the two managers met and discussed stuff.
Right, something like that. But it's often, we can find in the historical record that it's often been the subject of discussions at city council and in front of the commission as to what the pilot should be. That was also true of setting the pilot for the industrial class. Although in our last contract, what our contract says is it actually says specifically that the city council will decide how much the pilot is for the industrial class.
Okay, thanks, Sam.
Sure.
Tom?
Real quick question. The FS classification, that's what our financial statements show now? Was that what that means? That I'm pointing, you can't see what I'm pointing at. On the gross power collection slide, it says FS classification, and then some are operating revenue, some are non-operating revenue. That's what our financial statements say now?
Yes, that
So,
is correct.
so and the customer processing charges, the delinquent NSF charges, the late charges, the tampering charges, those are just pass-throughs, right? I mean, if we charge $10, it pretty much costs us $10 to do it, right?
That's correct.
So,
And yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so why wouldn't we leave those kind of things in the financial statements and in the calculation as things that we don't pay on? Because, I mean, if we have to pay the city 5% of a charge that a customer is paying us just to reimburse us for dealing with their NSF check, for instance, why should the city get 6% of that?
Well, that you kind of hit, I would probably, I'm gonna just throw an estimate. I would probably say that about 60% of the utilities around the US do it exactly the way you said, or you had described, where they just include the operating revenues from sales of electricity. And about 40% will also include in the calculation these other operating revenues, such as the joint use contact. So it's part of the reason why I recommended to keep those or in there is because you were currently doing it now. And I didn't want to make a dramatic change in the payment either way. So I kind of did a hybrid in a sense between my industry experience and your current methodology, and to try to get it to work as easily as possible and in a manner that was, in my opinion, consistent with the industry and how they do it. Does that kind of make some sense?
Yeah, wouldn't it be consistent with the industry and not require us to change our financial statements again by just including the operating revenue for the city, which is another $55,000 or so at 9% of that number? Include that as something we do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, it's a relatively minor amount. I mean, if you look at the bottom part of this, you're
Yeah,
talking about 2, 3,
yeah. So
maybe $400,000 at 6%. It's about 24,000 a year, and then we're including the city revenues as an
Yeah.
offset.
So
So
wouldn't it be better just to not change our financials, because there are rules about how our financials are supposed to work. They're set up now the way it's supposed to do it. Mark and the other staff have gone through several years of straightening them out. What if we just did the calculation based on our current financial statement categories, and if it's operating revenue, we do that, and the only adjustment is the bad debt? And that'll give the city roughly what it's getting now, right?
probably almost identical. We could run the numbers and get back with you on it.
That's easy for you, right, Mark?
Yeah, it's easy. Yeah,
I'm sorry, Mark Beauchamp.
oh yeah.
Yeah, Mark Denmeyer.
Yeah, I was just wanted to respond on the question of those other operating revenues. So FERC accounting actually does classify them above, like to be included in operations and operating and calculating net revenue or income from operations. Sorry. So in our budget document this year, for the first time, we have moved those revenues up into the category that, rather than being in non-operating income, they're in operating income. They're not sales, they're other operating income. And that's consistent with FERC, and we haven't treated them that way in the past. And I believe Mark Beauchamp, Mr. Beauchamp, he moves those up in when he computes our cost of service, and the auditors move them when they do our audit as well. So for those revenues, we actually haven't been classifying them properly in our internal financials, and so we intended to change that this year, and it just coincided with this. process. Actually, we became aware of it through this process.
Okay, but the conservation revenue stays below is a
Mhm.
non-operating, right?
Right.
Okay, and that's why, so we get some back that way, and that's why there's a $20,000 difference rather than a $55,000 difference with the city. Because those come out, right?
Yeah, there are some reductions and some adds, and yeah, in the calculations that I did, it was about a net increase to the city of 20,000, and that was including the revenues down there on the bottom. If you excluded those, then it would be, yeah, it would be probably a little less in the end, but close to what we're paying, what we've historically paid.
Okay, thank you. That answers my concerns. Thank you.
Other questions or discussions on the pilot?
No, thank you.
Okay.
Do you, I know I've gone over my time. I have one more area to discuss, which is the fees. This is my last slide. Do you want me to just go through this quickly, or do you want me to wait for the next board meeting?
We've got 9 minutes, Mark, so.
Okay, good. What we did is we looked at your electric fees. These are not rates, but fees. And the difference is rates are billed to customers on a regular routine basis. Fees, in a sense, are one-time charges. In other words, if a customer wants to disconnect their meter and then reconnect it, those are one-time charges. And there's only one exception. There's one that's an ongoing charge, and I'll discuss that in a moment. But what we did here is, we looked at what you're currently charging for each of your fees. And we looked at how much it costs to actually do that. In other words, we looked at the labor, the amount of time it takes, what the labor rates are, the overhead rates, the truck cost. And this is like the customer processing. We're charging 22, cost is right around 31. So once we've identified the cost of service for each of the components, we then tried to develop a strategy to phase it in. And we got input from staff, including the customer service department, to give us some guidance on what they felt would be a good number. Even though it was a one-time charge, some customers it may repeat. So like the customer processing charge, we proposed $3 increase each year from 22 to 28 over the 2-year period. Delinquent processing charges would go up from 22 to 30 in year 1, then to 35. Non-sufficient fund check charge, you're charging 23. Cost came in right at 23. So we just proposed keeping it at that level. The reconnect charges, 27. Cost of service said it should be about $63. So we propose increasing it over, we still have a ways to go after the 2 years, but to move it up from 27 to 35 and then to 40. And of course, we still have to go another $23 at a later date, but to continue that process. That's a reconnect fee during normal business hours. Reconnect after hours, you're charging $150. Study came in about $160, and so that's what we proposed after 2 years. Late charge, you charge 1.5% per month when it's past due, and we felt that was an adequate percentage. Tampering charge. Now this one's a bit more subjective. You're charging $130 plus repair costs. Now we're proposing that number goes to $250 plus repair costs. Now tampering charges is something that it isn't just the cost that you're of service amount to deal with the tampering issue. I mean, that's something obviously there's more involved in that. So in a sense, the 250 is probably above what the cost is, because we want it to be some degree to be punitive if they're tampering with our meter. So So what we're proposing is that number to go from 130 to 250. Now, in other places where we've set that fee, it was set at like $500 in many other places because they want it to be somewhat punitive. If a customer tampers with your cash register, so to speak, they want to make sure that there's a penalty associated with beyond the cost. Meter testing charge, slight increase from 90 to 105 over 2 years. Design application fee from 100. Cost services should be about 200. We're proposing to go to 150 and keeping at that. Temporary power fees at 150. We're proposing to go to 160. These were left alone, which is conservation loan fees. I think those were recently established. Irrigation seasonal reconnect fees, 368. Now, that was set by looking at what the monthly customer charge was for irrigation times 8 for 8 months. And it was done to try to prevent irrigators from disconnecting their service just to save on the monthly customer charge. So because what we initially proposed in the rate design, we're proposing a slight increase in their monthly customer charge. We're proposing that 368 go to $400 in the second year. Then this one, this is probably in many ways the most controversial one. It's a remote read, meter read. You have one customer on the system that when you put in your AMI system, there was one customer who opted out. So he still has the old meter. And so every month you have to go read that meter. And most utilities charge an additional fee because it's expensive to send a person out with a truck across town to read a meter and then come back. So when we calculated the cost, it came out at $25. And of course, one of the things that we had an extensive discussion about is that we didn't really want to go from $2, this is charged monthly, all the way to 25, but that we should eventually get to the 25. So what we propose is to go from $2 to $9, or a $7 a month increase for this one customer. And then the next year to go $6 to 15. And that way it would be enough to get their attention, in a sense, but not enough to dramatically affect them financially. So that one was a bit more of a subjective assessment on our part and staff's part. And I was just wondering about, in looking at these fees and what our proposals are, if you have any questions.
Any questions for Mark? I think you did a really good job of laying that out, Mark, and talking to staff and having rationale behind each of those.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the only one I think you'll get complaints about is the remote meter read. See if I'm right about that, but I think that person's going to call.
Scott, are these slides available to us? I couldn't figure out where they were.
Yeah, they're in the packet under Mark's tab.
And what's Mark's tab called?
It is under the public hearing. So it would be public hearing to consider. So like the third thing down on the agenda.
Ready. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I had it open actually.
Okay. Tom?
Before we finish, is this the point where you ask if anybody who's attending the meeting other than the commission has questions or?
We do, and the only one that's on the line is Mark Davis. As I've gone through, everybody else is commission and staff, and we are keeping the public hearing open. Mark does have his hand raised, so Trina, if I know we're out of time, but let's open up Mark and just see what he has to say. Welcome,
Thank you,
Mark.
Mr. Mayor. First I have a question. Maybe my video will come on. Okay.
There you go.
The actual rate increase will be, you'll have another hearing for that, right? So I don't need to comment on that. In fact, it sounded like you're still trying to figure out what the rate increase will be. Is that
Yes,
correct?
this will be all back in front of us in our August 17th meeting at 5 p.m. with additional work that Mark Beauchamp would bring out. And it gives you an opportunity to think through that which you have received today.
Okay. Could I ask Mr. Beauchamp a question?
Absolutely.
Okay. I saw on the reserve slide that you had a minimum reserve balance of about $16 million. And it seemed like it was comprised of a number of events that might happen, but would be highly unrealistic to all happen in 1 year. When looking at the $35 million that is actually in the reserves, what justification is there? And let me back up and say, I'm not opposed to that $34 million. I think it's probably why we, have such low rates, and I understand it. But I'm thinking in a practical way. I mean, that's ratepayer money that's come in and then is being saved. I mean, why do we need $34 million as opposed to $16 million, which is what you're showing as the minimum there on that slide?
That's a great question, Mr. Davis. It serves, basically it's there to protect the ratepayers in a sense, to protect them from two standpoints. One, that if something unexpected happened, the money is there to make the repair and replacement, and if something large does occur and major capital happens, and it does happen with utilities, that we don't have to have a large increase at one time, that we can buffer that in over time with smaller periodic rate adjustments, which has been the board's philosophy. And then there's another thing that McMinnville Light and Power does not have in their rates, which most utilities throughout the US do. And that is what's called a power cost adjustment. So they don't change the rates based on any changes in BPA's rates is not automatically passed through. So McMinnville holds that and basically buffers those changes for their customers. And that cash is also used in a sense as a rate stabilization fund against changes for BPA. So it's really there to protect the ratepayers. And the other thing to remember, Mark, let's say hypothetically, and I know this is not what you're proposing, but let's say we said, okay, let's give that money back to our ratepayers. So we reduce rates by 5%. So also we get into that cycle where we start getting into a cash burn situation. Now all of a sudden our cash starts getting to the minimum level. We have to do and usually we still have our capital program. So we have to do two things. We have to reverse the cash burn, and get the cash back up. So that usually leads to large rate adjustments. And so we're trying to avoid it. That's what I mean, Mr. Davis. It's kind of a balance, trying to pull it all together. It's a balancing effect in a sense. So I hope that helped answer your question. I know it was kind of lengthy.
Thank you. I think I understand what you're saying. I mean, I could see maybe it being reduced a little, but I think that the range it's in is it's good conservative accounting, and I'm a retired accountant, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mark, for your
Retired accountant?
along with many other
Good to
things.
see you in person.
Well, again, I will announce again for those on the line, we will have this public hearing is continued to August 17th, 5 o'clock. And so we will have more discussion. That'll move us.
Mayor, is there a possibility to get a motion to that effect?
I would so move.
A second?
Second.
It's been moved by Ed and seconded by Tom. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
I think Kathy might have seconded.
Oh, okay.
Was it Tom?
We both did. I think I was third, Ed.
And any opposed? Okay, so the public hearing has been a continuation till August 17th.
So Jody's wondering if we could take a break.
Would people just like to take a 5-minute break?
45-minute, perfect, yeah.
No, 5-minute break. We'll be back at 5:10. Okay.
Thank you.